He has covered Ontario and Canadian politics for almost 40 years. Today in conversation with Steve Paikin, the host of TVO's The Agenda. Welcome to the program, Steve.
Gosh, when you put it that way, boy, does that make me sound ancient. I guess I am. Yeah. Thanks, Jamie.
Well, sorry about that, Steve, but you have been doing this for a while, and that's why I'm really glad we have you virtually in studio today so we can have a conversation primarily about the pandemic. And let's start, first of all, with how the pandemic has affected your career as I look at you working from, I suppose, the attic of your home.
Well, that is exactly right. We at TVO made a decision almost instantly after this pandemic hit that we were going to stay on the air throughout, but we needed to figure out how to do that because essentially the company and the landlord, I guess, where we are in Midtown Toronto, had made a decision that nobody was coming into work anymore. They essentially wanted to seal the building. And so we had to figure out how to keep the program, the agenda, on the air while nobody is there. And there's no other current affairs show, daily current affairs show, I think anywhere in North America, where the host is hosting from home, the producers are producing from home, the director is directing from home. You know, everything is happening from home. We have nobody in our master control right now. We have nobody in our control room. So it's quite a technological achievement that, not me obviously, but some people figured out how to get this done. And we've been doing it every day.
And this is a reality for millions of people around the world working from home right now. You have a family. How's the adjustment been for you at a personal level?
You know, not that bad. I have to say, I'm up in the attic probably 12 hours a day, so there's probably a lot that goes on in levels below me that I don't know about. But, you know, I've got a 17-year-old daughter who's doing some schoolwork and some dog walking and some socializing with friends, and she gets through her day. And my wife is sort of running her small consultancy from her office, one floor below me. And so we don't really see each other at all during the course of the day. And then we all get together for dinner and usually watch a show. And then I come back up here for another couple hours and get ready to, you know, for the next day. So that's basically been my life every day for the last, 10, 11 weeks.
So let's get into the pandemic and the impact it has had on everyone. But certainly from a political point of view, you have done thousands of interviews over your career. But let's say for the last 10 or 11 weeks, you've just been talking about the pandemic. Is this the biggest story you have ever covered?
I guess it is, but I hesitate to say so because who knows, you know, how it's going to end or where it's going to end. So one never knows. But in terms of the biggest disruption to peace, order, and good government and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, this does seem to be the most profoundly life-changing story that probably any of us have covered during the course of our lives. You and I are sitting here on a Monday afternoon taping this right now. A little later this week, we are going to have on our program a rabbi from Hamilton who just turned 100 years old. So he's the only person I've talked to during the course of all of this who was even alive the last time this happened, referring, of course, to the Spanish flu back in 1919. He was a child. He doesn't have any firsthand memories of it. But yeah, and even he says this is the biggest thing that's ever happened in his life. So I'm going to take his word on that.
Yes, you're right, 100 years. Pandemics apparently come around about that frequently, the Spanish flu as you've referenced.
Not beer, Jamie, just for the record. Tea.
I understand
tea,
it's
not
tea
beer.
in a beer mug.
but it is tea.
So this is interesting because the one thing that I think we have seen through this is that we have seen people that we might not have got to know personally. We are getting to know them more personally because of this virtual reality. And I'll give the example of Premier Doug Ford making cheesecake from his home. Has there ever been a more profound example of an image change to a politician than what the Premier of Ontario has undergone over the last few weeks?
Not that I can recall. And I'll tell you something, let's remember where this guy started. You know, the first year of his premiership was about the worst first year of any premier I can recall. And I've covered, I guess, well, I wrote a book about John Robarts, who was the premier 50 plus years ago, and have covered every premier since then. So that's Bill Davis through Doug Ford. And Mr. Ford's first year was, I guess, the worst, the most precipitous decline in popularity of any premier I had ever seen. And then the pandemic hit. And, you have to say, I mean, we have empirically provable evidence to back this up. He rose to the occasion. The story's not over. Let's see what happens. But so far, the initial notices on him have been quite positive. There was some polling done by Abacus, I guess, a week or so ago, which showed that, I guess, Premier Horgan in BC and Premier Ford in Ontario and Premier Legault in Quebec are the three most popular and respected leaders in the country right now because of the way they've handled this COVID situation. They've got approval numbers in the mid to high 80s. Now, if anybody had said 4 months ago that Doug Ford would be one of the most popular premiers in the country based on how he responded to the challenge of a global pandemic, people would have seriously scratched their heads at that. But we are where we are, and there you go. He's done it, and I mean the job is not over, obviously, and you wouldn't want to declare any premature victories on this. I hasten to remind people that all Winston Churchill did was win World War II, and in the election immediately after the war was over, he lost. So the job is not done, and nobody's making any predictions on what the outcome of the next election will be in 2 years this month, actually.
And Winston Churchill, of course, also famously said during the Second World War, never waste a good crisis. And certainly this is a crisis, and it is a defining moment for many politicians. So let's talk about the difference between Canada and the United States. Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump. Very different personalities, and certainly a very different approach from one nation to the other on the way it has communicated through the pandemic in both countries.
Yeah, two different approaches because they're two different guys and they have two different sets of priorities and they project themselves to the world differently. Justin Trudeau's he's an emotional guy. He is a very empathetic individual. Right from the get-go in Canada, he decided that we were going to protect people from the worst ravages of this pandemic, and he, on a daily basis, has been rolling out programs in order to do just that, to give effect to that. Donald Trump made quite clear from the get-go that, regardless of how many people this pandemic kills, I'm not responsible. I'm responsible for nothing, I think was his exact quote. He delights in attacking members of the media. He delights in getting into Twitter fights. He delights in giving himself an A+ rating for how well he's handled this. And meantime, 100,000 Americans are dead. People will make up their own minds about which style of leadership they prefer. They will make up their own minds as to who has been a more effective leader during the course of this. But I note that I think the better comparison, actually, Jamie, is not necessarily Trudeau and Trump. It's Ford and Trump, because both of those guys got elected to be populist, conservative, disruptive influences on their respective jurisdictions. And Ford, for all of that, rose to the occasion and has been getting good notices for how well he's handling things so far. Not perfectly, but better than most. And Trump, on the other hand, has been getting abysmal notices for how disgracefully he has handled things. And his tweets over the violence that we've seen over the past few days in the United States have probably not added to his luster. So to me, that's the more germane comparison. One guy has risen to the occasion, and one guy sure has not.
On the subject of political leadership, what has been lost in this has been the voice of the opposition, and for good reason. Daily news conferences updating pandemic numbers, whether or not things are going to be able to reopen, whether they might take a regional approach here in Ontario to opening things up, which is still being debated. But you wrote in a recent blog, you said, "It is hard to do the math on this, but I'd be willing to bet that prime ministers, premiers, cabinet ministers, mayors, and chief medical officers of health are taking up probably 95% of the available microphone time these days. Whenever I'm watching an all-news channel, someone from that list is almost always on. I'd also guess that official opposition leaders are grabbing about 4% of available time before the cameras. This means if you're not part of one of those groups, you are fighting for what might literally be just 1% of what is left. To use a hockey analogy, how can you possibly stay relevant and make a contribution with so little ice time?"
Yeah, and it's not only how do you make a contribution under those circumstances, but you actually have, you have democratic responsibilities as an opposition, official or otherwise. And how hard is it to perform those responsibilities when essentially the government of the day has the monopoly on the microphone. I think that was what I wrote at that time, and I forget the date on it, but it's probably 2 or 3 weeks ago already. I think that was true when I wrote it. It's a little different today, and I noticed the opposition. This is completely understandable. At the beginning of at the beginning of any crisis, everybody tends to give whoever's in power the benefit of the doubt, and there is certainly a kind of a rallying around the flag that we see. And I think, Ontarians, I think that in part explains why Doug Ford's popularity numbers are as good as they are. They had such fears for the man because he was inexperienced in provincial affairs. There were such low expectations for him because, again, not very experienced and a bad first year, and he's overperformed. And I think also opposition parties and members tend to give a little space to those who are in power at that time to let them kind of get their hands around this crisis. But as that has taken place and as more decisions have been made and as a result, Premier Ford has to defend, or Prime Minister Trudeau has to defend the decisions that they are now making, we are starting to see the opposition being able to play a larger role. And you'll notice now, the legislature has been sitting, the House of Commons has been sitting, both actually and virtually. They're starting to call, Andrew Scheer, the Conservative leaders, on TV almost every morning now, having a press conference about something. Andrea Horwath, the official opposition leader in Ontario, leader of the NDP, is on television almost every day now with a press conference of her own. But that was something that couldn't happen in the first 2 months of this thing because it was just still such a shock to the system. Now that we're getting a handle on it, I guess, they are starting to carve out their appropriate roles, both to be supportive where necessary, right? A lot of the first programs that got through with unanimous consent in both legislatures. So obviously the opposition had to be helpful to make that happen, but also to play that appropriately critical role where necessary as well.
Let's talk about the economic impact, which we've seen some of it for sure. We don't know how we're going to come out of this, and we don't know how long we're going to be in it. Right. What we do know is that both the Ontario and the Canadian government have responded with a significant financial infusion into the economy to keep people working. But we also know that that big price tag will somehow come back to roost. What can we anticipate? And certainly this will be a thing I'm sure the opposition will at some level be critical of, because there is a large deficit and debt that is being left behind from this.
Well, Jamie, let me put it this way. I think generational politics were one of the largest stories in the world going into this pandemic, right? I mean, debts and deficits were already, fairly sizable. I'm not saying unmanageable, but they were fairly sizable before the pandemic hit. Now we've got the government of Canada, just this 1 year alone, being prepared to go more than $250 billion into additional debt, again, in order to roll out programs to protect people now. The government of Ontario, after running a deficit of about 5 or 6 or 7 billion, whatever last year, can't remember right now, will go from that to 41 billion in 1 year. So yes, both levels of government are borrowing an astonishing amount of money to help people through all this. Listen, I don't hear anybody saying they had any alternative. I don't care where on the political spectrum you are. I don't hear anybody saying they shouldn't have done it. They should have just, let people fall off a cliff. Nobody's saying that. So, if different parties were in power, I'm not sure the response would be a whole heck of a lot different. But yes, generationally speaking, these are debts being incurred to assist the current generation. And let's also remember, this COVID-19 disease, is hitting older people more than it's hitting younger people. So if younger people were already upset at the level of debt that is going to have to be repaid by them when they get older and get into the workforce, they're going to be even more upset about it now because all of these additional debts are being incurred in order to help people who are mostly, your age, my age, the age of our aunts and uncles and parents and grandparents. Those are the ones who are, facing the biggest risk in all of this. But once again, those bills, those chickens will come home to roost when the younger generation is in place to start paying the taxes. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be a mess. But again, what's the alternative? You're going to let a whole bunch of people die? I don't think so.
Talking about death, and certainly there have been more than 7,000 deaths in Canada. over 2,200 in Ontario as we do this interview, and certainly many more people have been infected. One of the places that has been hardest hit has been long-term care centers, and there was a damning report, a military report that came out a few days ago about the status of long-term care. You've done some interviews on that. This is one of the greatest tragedies that is coming out of this pandemic, certainly in this province. What is your takeaway from what's been learned to this point, and where are we heading because of this, because of the number of deaths that have occurred in long-term care?
Well, this is the story of the pandemic as far as the province of Ontario and Canada are concerned. 80% of the deaths in the province of Ontario have been in what they call congregate care settings. So long-term care homes, seniors' residences, shelters, that kind of thing. All of the lessons apparently that we learned from SARS, which was back in 2003, about making sure that there was one public, personal services worker per home, that you couldn't go into multiple homes. Okay, apparently we forgot about that lesson. One frail elderly senior per room in every long-term care setting. Apparently we forgot about that lesson, because in some places there's 4 per room. When you think about all the things that need to be in place to prevent the spread of this virus, none of the lessons learned apparently from 2003 have been applied over the intervening 17 years, which contributed to where we are right now. I'd make a couple of other quick observations. Number one, I interviewed last week for another column that I wrote, somebody, and I won't identify who she is or where she lived, but she used to be a long-term care home inspector. And the amount of, I think I used the word corruption in the piece, because it's a corrupt practice. Inspectors gathering in a parking lot outside a long-term care home before going in to inspect, and the senior member of that crew saying to everybody else, the owner of this place is a friend of a friend, we're not going to find anything. Or conversely, meeting in the parking lot and saying, this guy done me wrong, and so we're going to find everything. We're going to throw the book at them. I mean, that kind of unethical conduct is another lesson that has emerged from this. So the inspection regimen has really got to be changed as well. These are some important lessons that have been learned. And of course, the saddest part of it all right now, and I see comments on Twitter all the time, I get emails to this effect every day. There are parents and grandparents who are going to die in long-term care homes without their children or grandchildren being able to come in and say goodbye to them, because these homes are now off limits to all outsiders. And, that's another tragedy. It's bad enough that people are going to die from this disease. They're going to die alone. Not alone in terms of the people who are in those homes helping them. From most of what we hear, they're fantastic. And in fact, this inspector I talked to said, you can't believe they're angels. A lot of the people in these homes are angels who take care of our most frail and most elderly. But to think of the conditions that a lot of these people are going to die in without ever having a chance to say goodbye to their children or grandchildren stinks.
It's very sad, and when you look at it from a labor market perspective, there was already a shortage of personal support workers in particular, and healthcare workers in long-term care facilities. Yep. This is not exactly the type of information that is out there now that kind of encourages someone to pursue a role that would involve working in long-term care centers, but we certainly have to change that, don't we? Because we have this labor market need.
Well, we've got to do a bunch of things here. And number one, I'm not sure that the way it's been described to me is this is a calling that people either feel or they don't feel. And, if you feel this calling to help people, particularly the most vulnerable among us, you're the closest thing to godliness on earth, I guess. So the people who feel that way, we do certainly want to encourage them to go into this field, because we're going to need more and more people doing this work. And we should remunerate them properly. I'm not an expert. I don't know what that rate is, but obviously the government of Ontario believes it ought to be higher than what it was, because they've put a pandemic premium on wages into effect since the pandemic hit. So they got to be properly paid. They shouldn't have to work in 4 or 5 or 6 different congregate care settings in order to make a living. That's one of the reasons they do, right, Jamie? They work in 6 homes and look after all these different people, not necessarily because they want to. It'd be way easier to just work in one home. They do it because they have to, because it's like piecemeal work, right? They don't have a good paying, good jobs with benefits, and so they've got to pick up work where they can get it. And of course, that's a great way for the disease to spread from place to place to place. So yeah, we need a big rethink of all of that if we want to not only stop this disease, but encourage people to go into a field that their heart tells them to go into, but we shouldn't stick their noses in the mud to make them do it, right? We should treat them with respect if they're going to do that work for us.
And as difficult as it has been to watch and hear about these stories from long-term care, there have been some bright lights within the healthcare sector. I'm thinking about a story that's local here in Renfrew County where we have paramedics who are doing, supporting a virtual triage center, which is giving access to people, virtually, family doctors, practitioners, what have you, which has been one of the wins that has come out of this, is that we have had to recreate the way we do business. And there has been a tremendous amount of innovation. And you must see examples of that as well through the interviews that you've done.
Well, apropos of that quote from Churchill's earlier,
Yes.
We can't let a good crisis go to waste. So this does prevent, as much as nobody's enjoying this pandemic right now, some people are coping with it better than others, but it does offer us this opportunity to completely rethink the way we do so many things. And I mean, oh my goodness, where do you want to start? We're going to have to completely rethink how we go to the movies, how we eat in restaurants, how we work. I mean, is this going to be the way more often than not that we work going forward? Is this show that I'm doing going to go back into a studio someday? I don't know. Until we have a vaccine, I don't know what the answer to that question is. There seems to be a consensus that in spite of the fact that most people are not going to want to ride crowded subway trains or buses after this, we are going to keep building subways and buses. So, okay, maybe that won't change all that much. But, maybe not so much where you are, but where I am, there are a lot of very tall buildings in the downtown of the city I'm working in right now. And I think a lot of people are asking the question about whether or not it makes sense to put 7,000 people into a 55 or 60 or 80-story building anymore every single day going to and from work. And what the highways maybe would look like if you didn't put so many people in cars going to work back and forth every day. The numbers of questions are just endless. And, we're not going to have all the answers, obviously, starting right now, but, we're going to start to figure it out over time. And some things are going to be, I suspect, totally different going forward. And other things will just go back to the way they were, I suspect. And which will be which is the great story that I look forward to covering.
Well, one of the stories you might be covering is what some people call the urban-rural divide. Rural areas have struggled for years around internet connectivity. That has really become a major issue, particularly around access to education for both children as well as post-secondary students that are in rural areas. But at the same time, the virtual reality of how we're conducting business now may open up a huge opportunities for rural areas as well to actually grow their populations if people can work from home.
Well, not only that, but yeah, the price of housing in certainly in Ottawa, in Toronto, even to some extent in Hamilton now, the price of housing is going up and up and up. And if the reality is that in the future we're going to be working more from home as opposed to having to go into an office every single day, how many more people, I wonder, are not going to, not just because they can't, because they don't want to, they're going to be happy to live someplace outside Toronto, because if you can do business this way, why not buy someplace bigger, more affordable, more family friendly than, say, a 500 square foot condo in downtown Toronto. So yes, I definitely see that kind of thing happening. To me, one of the great interesting stories, and you've put your thumb on it right here, the urban-rural divide in Ontario is fascinating because originally Doug Ford said we're going to reopen this province for everybody at the same pace on a particular day, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and so on. And I think he's come to realize, based on the advice he's getting, that it is one province of Ontario, but it's also so many different regions. And he's come to understand that 80% of the problem is in the Greater Toronto Area. And there are great swaths of this province, maybe you're in one of them, where there are either few or no cases at all. And the question then becomes, can those parts of Ontario get back to normal sooner, or do we all have to wait for Toronto to get its act together? And I think they're coming around to the notion that, yes, if you're not overrun by COVID and things are sort of under control, then why not? Why not let other places open sooner? That would certainly give rural Ontario and more remote parts of the province a chance to reopen their economies and get going sooner. You know, I'm always reminded of the fact that so many people, I wonder about the urban-rural divide, Jamie, because I know there are a lot of people in urban settings in the province that have cottages in rural Ontario, and they love rural Ontario. They love going to rural Ontario. It's a great, you know, it's a great chance to clear the mind and get away and just enjoy all the beauty that rural Ontario has to offer. And I know that some city types were sad about the fact that they couldn't go to their cottages, or were certainly being strongly urged not to go to their cottages because you know, health officials were worried they'd be bringing COVID-19 with them, and nobody wanted to see the outbreak spread. Everybody gets that. So the big hope is that it's going to be contained enough, not only to allow people to enjoy their seasonal residences, which they want to do, but also let's remember, there are people in rural Ontario who basically have 5 months of the year to make 12 months worth of income. And those 5 months, it's tick-tock, 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 right? The clock is ticking on those 5 months. And I suspect many of them are getting to the point now where they are saying, we got to open this thing up, or what the heck am I going to have to live on from, you know, October of 2020 to March or April of 2021. So all of these things are in play right now.
We're down to about a minute left, and as you take a sip of your tea, I want to remind everybody it's a cup of tea, but it does make me think of sports. And I know you're a huge sports fan, and it appears that every league wants to get back to playing. The Canadian Football League is a unique proposition, though, and I know you're a Hamilton Ticat fan.
I'm from Hamilton, yes.
Can the CFL come through this? Because right now it looks like deaf ears as far as the government package, the request that was made by the commissioner.
Well, I interviewed Randy Ambrosie, the commissioner, just last week, and he said it's a continuing conversation. So you wouldn't want to say it's deaf ears yet, but you would, I mean, they're not, they said if the worst possible outcome happens, it's $150 million that we're going to be out this year, and could the government see fit to help us out with that? I don't think anybody thinks it's going to be that drastic, so maybe something in between will help. But yes, I mean, I don't know about you, I'm taping all the old baseball games on TV and watching them, and thankfully I'm old enough to have forgotten the outcomes of those games, so it's like watching them all afresh. But I sure hope something comes back, because I do miss sports desperately, Jamie, as I'm sure you do too.
Absolutely do, absolutely. It's been great talking to you. Very, very insightful as always, and keep up the great work on the agenda. I enjoy your interviews very much.
Thanks for saying so, and I look forward to you and I being able to sit down and have our next chat in person.
A cup of tea, indeed.
With a cup of tea, exactly.
Steve Paikin, the anchor of TVO's The Agenda, in conversation today, speaking about the pandemic and its impact on society. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.